Everybody, so in this video we're going to be having a look at the final exam question, which we haven't tackled yet, which is the 12-mark source question. So I'm going to base this on the sources from the Sudetenland, because we did the Sudetenland in the last video, so hopefully that's quite fresh in your memory. And we're going to be having a look at how to approach this question, what it's actually asking, and then we'll have a look at the mark scheme and sort of how to formulate your thoughts around these sources. So I'm going to show you the question first of all. So study sources B and C. How useful are sources B and C to a historian studying why Britain allowed Hitler to take the Sudetenland? Explain your answers using sources B and C and your contextual knowledge. Okay, so this question is a big question, this, and I know it's only 12 marks, which gives you around 15 minutes to answer it, but it's a big question in terms that you could probably write about this all day. I know I could. With this question, there will always be a written source and a picture source, and what's important, and I say this every time we talk about an exam question, is to answer the question that is being asked. Now, study sources B and C. How useful are sources B and C to a historian studying why Britain allowed Hitler to take the Sudetenland? Explain your answer using sources B and C and your contextual knowledge. Now, what's important about this question, and I say this because my students get this wrong all the time, and I have it on a big poster on my classroom wall. It is not, and what it's not asking you is really important, because we do it in other papers, and we do it quite often as historians, is compare sources to each other. This question is not asking you which is the most useful. Okay, now often in conclusions for this question, I will get in conclusion, source B is more useful than source C. It's not asking you that, it's asking you as a pair, how useful are they? It's not asking you to make a judgment between them. It's saying, right, if you were a historian and you were just given these two sources and you had to learn everything, you had to gain everything you could from these two, can you do it? Is it giving you enough information? Are they that useful to you? Now, for a useful question, I'm just going to put that in a box so we know that that's a separate statement to that one. In a useful question, we do use provenance. Okay, now the provenance of a source is where it's come from. So when it was written, who it was written by, and why it was written. Okay, so we use provenance, and we also use the content of the source and compare it to our own knowledge. Now, I'm going to show you the examiner's tips for this before we tackle the sources. I'm just going to rub that bit out for now because I'm going to annotate the sources next to it. Okay, so let's just go down and just have a look at the examiner's tips for this. So, question number 2. Remember to critically consider both the content and the provenance of each source in order to come to a judgment backed up with evidence. Remember to assess the usefulness of a source. You could write about the type, the author, their role, place, date of publication, and don't talk about the as well as. You haven't got time to do all of that. Or, sorry, as in you haven't got time to do all of those when you're talking about the provenance. You'd focus on one or two. And the content of the speech itself, or whatever itself. You can explain both sides of the argument before reaching and explaining a final judgment. And as I said before, do the two sources tell you everything that you need to know? Okay, now we are also looking for you to compare the sources to each other. What you don't have to do, which it does say here, which since 2016, when this series first started, there's been some clarifications on what is expected. I went to a seminar with AQA about 2 years ago now, and they actually said you don't have to do this for each of the sources. You could do the content of one and the provenance of another, because you haven't really got time to do both for both of them. I'll clarify what I mean by that in a second. Right, so let's have a look at the sources themselves and sort of analyze them, and then we'll have a look at the mark scheme. Okay, so this is when we look, remember we need to analyze the provenance of the source, so we'll focus on that to start with. So this is a speech given by Hitler to the people of Berlin in 1938. Now, we know that obviously Hitler, and this is obvious, but we know we need to get it down, what's in our minds. He's the leader of Germany. We know that 1938 is when he took the Sudetenland. Now let's have a look at what he says. So we are not interested in breaking peace. I am thankful to Mr. Chamberlain, who's the Prime Minister of Britain, for all his trouble, and I assured him that the German people want nothing but peace. But I also declared that I cannot go beyond the limits of our patience. I further assured him, and I repeat here, that if this problem is solved, there will be no further territorial problems in Europe for Germany. Okay, so that's one thing that we're having a look at. Then we've got another source here, and this is from an Italian magazine on the 9th of October 1938. Now, the 9th of October 1938, and this shows Hitler and the Nazis walking in, and what's important here is looking at the people's faces, okay, at the support that is being given to the Nazis as they invade. So you're being asked in this question to say, right, what is this telling us? Are these two sources agreeing? Are these two sources agreeing? How are they differing? Why are they differing? What do you know? What don't they tell you? Now, when we're talking about source utility, what we often find is that people will say the source is useful because it tells me that, and I know blah, 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 and they'll give an example. What is really important is that you don't say the source isn't useful because it doesn't show this. Say the source is useful because it doesn't show us this. If it isn't showing you something, why not? So for example, you could say for source C is useful because it doesn't tell us that Hitler actually wanted the policy of Lebensraum and had every intention on using the Sudetenland as an area to then launch an attack on the rest of Czechoslovakia. And why isn't he saying that? That's really important. We know that that is what's going to happen, but why isn't he saying that? And why does that make this source useful? Why in a public speech is he not going to say that? And we need to get to the point that he's dependent on the policy of appeasement and on the British politicians trusting his statements that he's not going to go any further. That's really, really important for Hitler. And then the second one, when we're talking about the utility of this source, we need to think about how this demonstrates what everybody feels about the Nazi Party. Now, you can use examples from the Rhineland, from the Saar, from Anschluss, and again from the Sudetenland of people when the Nazis arrive, people smiling, people giving them flowers. It's a representation of how the Nazis have been greeted every time they've entered a country that they are essentially taking over. Now, this is from an Italian magazine, and this looks supportive of the Nazi invasion of the Sudetenland. And that's important because we know that now we've got the Rome-Berlin Axis. We've got this agreement and this alliance between the Germans and the Italians. So let's have a look quickly then at the mark scheme and to see what is expected, because I haven't got time to write this question out. So let's have a look then at this one. So obviously this is a different question. This mark scheme is from a different question, but it shows us the way in which we would go about answering this question. So if we start at the bottom, because then we can work our way up and see what the differences are. So for level 1, which is 1 to 3, which nobody's going to be aiming for, answers may show understanding or support for one or both sources. So if you talk about only one of them, you're not going to get above level 2 on this question, so you're not going to get above 6. But the case is made by assertion, so you're basically writing out whatever the source says, or basic inference. So you may identify basic features which are valid about the sources and related to the inquiry point. For example, source B mentions this or source C shows that, right? If you just repeat what the source says, you're going to get some marks, but let's face it, we're not aiming for some marks, we're aiming for those higher levels. So the second one, 4 to 6 marks, so a level 2 answer. Simple evaluation of the sources. So again, you can still get into this level if you only do one or the other, based on content and or provenance. Okay, so you can only do, if you do one or the other, you're going to be in this level. So you might say source B was produced by an organisation that supported the aims of the League, so it's bound to focus on the successes. So do you see, that's a really simple thing. You're not using your knowledge to back that up. You're not saying why that would be the case. You're making simple statements again still. And then for level 3, now again here, so we've got developed explanation of sources. So the S is no longer in brackets. So if you haven't done both of them, you aren't going to get into this level. To get into level 3, you have to have looked at both of them. But you can still have only done the provenance or the content. If you've not talked about both, you're not going to get above this level, but you can comfortably get into level 3. So you could say source B is a useful example of the peacekeeping work achieved by the League of Nations in the Åland Islands and the life-saving work of its agency in fighting diseases. Source B is useful for showing that even though Great Britain was an important part of the League, some people had a negative opinion of the League's role in the Manchurian crisis because it failed to prevent another powerful member from committing an act of war. So we've got some of our own knowledge in there. Now, where we then get into the highest level, a complex evaluation of both sources with sustained judgment based on content and provenance. So remember, you could just look at the content of one and then the provenance of another one, but then you've got to come to sort of looking at the relationship between them and how useful they are together. So this one looks at them both together. So this could be your conclusion. The sources are useful because they show how attitudes change over time. So we're looking at where sometimes you might have one that was produced in the 1920s, one which was produced in the 1930s. The content of source B shows that in the 1920s, wide-ranging public support was expected from across several social groups for the ambitious aims of the League, whereas in the date and provenance of source C shows that public confidence in the League has been undermined. This suggests that people are disillusioned and no longer believe that it is an effective peacekeeping force. So there are, in this one, at least in this question, there are clear-cut things that you have to do to get into each of the levels. What is important here, like I've said, I'm just going to go back to our question. What is important here is that you do answer the question. So you're looking at the sources and all you are answering is why Britain allowed Hitler to take the Sudetenland. So in this one, you need to read it and think, right, why, how is this showing me that why Hitler was allowed to take the Sudetenland? So here we know that Britain had adopted a policy of appeasement. Okay, they wanted to avoid war. So here, that's a really nice quote that you can use there. I cannot go beyond the limits of our patience. So if Britain had not allowed Hitler to take the Sudetenland, it could then lead to another war, and that's not what Britain wants to do. And then again, going with the policy of appeasement, if the problem is solved, there will be no further territorial problems. We know that they had an absolute trust of Hitler's intentions. Okay, so that's what you're focusing on. Why does this mean that they are going to let Hitler get away with the Sudetenland? And then this one, we're looking at the people's faces. We're looking at how in the past, so for examples, the Rhineland, the Saar, Anschluss, we know that these are all examples of the German people, remember, of which there was a lot in the Sudetenland, the German people being pleased by the Nazi takeover. Okay. Now, like I said, I don't have time to go through that whole answer, but if you would like to have a go at answering it, please feel free. Any even planning out answers and doing these kind of activities are really, really good for revision. So we have run out of time. I do hope that that was useful for you. I am going to cover a past paper in its entirety in the last video of this course, so please do tune into that and I'll go through this kind of question again. This, I can't stress this enough, this bit here. If you do answer that question and not the question that's being asked, you aren't going to get into that higher level because your conclusion will just be disregarded because that's not what the question's asking. So please just be mindful. I know when you go into an exam, there's so much to think about, but that's why practice and revision is really, really important. And it's why having a look at mark schemes and actually writing practice questions is as important in your revision as the actual content itself is, because if you haven't got that exam technique, that's half the battle. Okay, so I do hope that's been useful for you. Please carry on tuning in. We're nearly at the end of this course now. If you haven't watched previous videos, obviously, please feel free to go back and watch those. So thank you, and I will see you again.